Thomas Price, and legally and emotionally, I married your therapist.
Hi, I'm Ashlyn. I'm a licensed therapist. Just a quick reminder, I'm probably not your therapist.
You're not?
I'm not your therapist, that's for sure.
You're not my I have an actual therapist. I can't afford you. You cost the big bucks.
Yeah, that's right.
Today I want to talk to you about what I personally feel is a super overused word in the mental health space. I want to talk about trauma and all that it entails. I want you to define what trauma is for us. I want you to walk through the history of trauma being used in a diagnosis sort of capacity.
Sure.
And I would really like to break down what is coping in this context. What is a trigger in this context? I see so many people fundamentally misunderstanding what these concepts are. And when somebody is misunderstanding and then someone else comes along and says, I was traumatized by this behavior. Well, if, the person who's misunderstanding believes that trauma can only exist if you were, in combat.
Right.
Then there may be a disagreement or a lack of effective communication between those two groups. And I see that all the time where somebody says, look at this liberal snowflake who's traumatized by everything.
Right.
Because the person making those accusations doesn't understand. They're not using the same language.
Yeah, the definition really varies in the way that we understand it.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, and I think that, if you're going to make fun of somebody for being a liberal snowflake, I want you to be equipped with the
Use the proper language.
I'm kidding. Snowflakes, we love you. We love you here. So talk to me about, let's just start with the definition of trauma. What is trauma?
Yeah, well, trauma is what happens when an experience overwhelms your ability to cope. And so it's not the experience itself, it's just that the experience overwhelmed your ability to cope. So it can apply to a multitude of situations, which is why it gets used in so many different cases.
So your ability to cope, what could you give us an example of a traumatizing situation? Yeah,
so coping is your ability to handle or recover from something. Recover is probably a good word. Give you an example of a traumatic situation.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, right, let's talk about, when I'm talking to clients about trauma, and kind of describing that, and people want to always, they're not the ones who are traumatized. Somebody else had it worse, of course. And so, you can be traumatized from anything to one of the big, newsworthy sorts of things that we think of as traumatizing and horrific, or getting lost in the grocery store as a kid. So with that example, we're talking about trauma and the ability to cope. So with that example, if you have a kiddo who gets lost in the grocery store, they're a little kid, haven't been lost before, suddenly their parent's gone. Well, that's going to well up this biological instinct for survival, which is that you have to have your caretaker to live. And to be separated from them is really, really scary. And so your alarms are going off, and maybe you're screaming or crying or you're panicking and
you're not separated at home. You're separated in
right.
a new,
you're in
big,
a new environment.
Place.
You're surrounded by strangers. Right. Absolutely. And so there may be two different scenarios that happen there. One is that mom and dad come around the corner and they help you with coping. They help you with that co-regulation where you're reminding yourself that the moment's over and that it's going to be okay and you can move on. You're going to survive it.
We scoop up kiddo. Yeah. We're hugging kiddo. We're telling him it's okay. We're patting their back, giving them a chance to kind of maybe cry a little.
You're allowing them to feel the rest of their feelings because probably while they were in that alarm state, they didn't get the chance to get it out. So now you've got the tears of relief for the, all the big feelings that follow.
So we've experienced trauma, but we've immediately coped. So it's not going to, in theory, leave a lasting mark.
Yeah, that kiddo knows that bad things can happen and it's going to be okay. They're going to make it through. They're not going to live in that moment anymore.
Yeah.
They're not still doubting their ability to survive.
What about the situation when mom and dad turn the corner and they're saying, where the heck were you?
Yeah, they're yelling and screaming.
Yeah, you scared me.
Yeah.
How could you? I told you to stay right here. You scared the crap out of me.
Yeah, exactly.
Why are you crying?
well, now the moment's not over, right? So maybe kiddo does stop crying. Their parent told them not to cry anymore. Why are you crying? Told them that they're in trouble, that they're to blame. And so there's a good chance in that scenario that you don't get to move through that moment, that you learn that sometimes you're separated from the sort of care and support that you need, and that something is inevitably and permanently changed moving forward, that things don't get to go back to what it was before, that you're stuck there, and that getting lost means that your caretakers no longer view you the same way. And again, that's a biological need. You need your caretakers to like love you and care about you, to want to keep providing support for you.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's something there that never really gets brought back. And so you might not remember that moment, but maybe years down the road, kiddo's a grown up and experiences a breakup, or experiences getting, separated from someone or whatever. And it triggers that old, when something changes like this, it never goes back. Things are never really okay again. And the other kiddo, the first kiddo whose parents scoop them up, they're going to feel their feelings. They're going to cry it out. It's going to be terrible. Being separated from anyone you love sucks. But they know that the world goes on. And something else about, those two scenarios, maybe it is that specific scenario that lives with you for a long time, but that's probably indicative of a lot of things happening differently.
Yeah, mom and dad turn the corner and yell and say, "Where were you?" They're probably not reacting.
That's probably happening
perfectly
a lot.
To a lot of scenarios, right? Yeah. Yeah, and that stuff just starts building and compounding on itself.
Yep. So it's not the situation itself. It's not that there's something innate about getting lost in the grocery store that means that you'll be traumatized. It's that it overwhelmed your ability to cope. Both of those kiddos very overwhelmed. But then the one kiddo had help regulating, help coping. They knew that their life was going to go back and that they were going to be okay and that the world was a safe place to be. And second kiddo doesn't get to learn that. And that moment might stay stuck with them, and that might be a trauma.
It reminds me of when I was hanging out with my friend Chris when we were little.
Mm-hmm.
It was his 6th or 7th birthday party.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody left his house to go to the Discovery Zone to play around in the park.
Yeah.
And I got left behind on accident because, Chris's mom thought that dad had me, and Chris's dad thought that mom had me. So I got left behind, and it was very scary because out here I was at this house I was not familiar with, and I was outside.
Yep.
And a neighbor saw me, and he had an elderly neighbor who welcomed me over, let me sit in his garage. I think he gave me a soda.
Mm-hmm.
They just talked to me and called the parents and let them know where I was, and they came and got me. And so immediately that scenario, which I could not cope with, being left alone,
right,
was immediately made into one that I remember kind of fondly because I felt so safe.
Yeah, you knew that the world was a safe place to be and that you were going to survive.
It was just a mistake.
Yep.
It wasn't, I was no longer in danger.
Right. You got to enjoy a nice soda, and the parents came and got you, and you went on and had your fun day.
And we all laughed about it because it was funny at that point because I was fine.
Yeah.
And that to me feels like a situation that could have been rather traumatizing had I not been given the opportunity to cope by that lovely elderly man who
that's so great. I love that happened.
yeah So talk to me a little bit about, because you specialize in trauma. Why do you specialize in trauma? What has interested you in trauma specifically, in helping people work through their trauma?
Well, I do think that it's something that so many people have trauma and don't have access to the language to describe what's happened. And when you do have something like that where that moment gets stuck, you don't get to move into that future of, this is something that happened to me in the past, I can move forward now. You stay stuck in that moment. And a lot of people, don't know that there's anything that you can do now, so many years down the road or whatever, to be able to move forward from it. And so it's such a wonderful process to get to be a part of, letting somebody leave that finally in the past and to know this is a horrible thing that did happen, but it's no longer happening. And I have a sense of power and control in the world. I love getting to be a part of that. And I've gotten to be a part of that process many times over the years, being a sexual assault victim advocate and seeing people move through those initial stages of, more of a current trauma, and gotten to see people move through childhood traumas, things that happened a long time ago. And I think that it's really empowering to see somebody who's stuck in the past get to move forward and see a new future for themselves. I love that. You're like helping somebody rewrite their own story.
So if trauma is us facing a difficult situation and being unable to cope, then that means that every single person who has ever lived has experienced trauma at some point.
Yeah.
And we talk about, you just mentioned getting stuck, that some people are very stuck in their trauma.
Sure.
None better illustrated than the combat veteran freaking out on the 4th of July because he's hearing explosions go off, and his body starts acting like he's in an active combat situation. He starts sweating, breathing heavily, hyperventilating, just to name it. I'm just kind of...
Sure, yeah.
But those are things that can happen, and for the longest time, the diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was pretty exclusive for combat veterans, correct?
Yes. So this definition of trauma that we're talking about, this having the experience of having a situation that overwhelms your ability to cope, hasn't always been the way that we've understood trauma. So early on with the PTSD diagnosis, the first time we're really like clinically talking about that, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is the author of The Body Keeps the Score, a book about trauma and how it lives in our bodies. And so he's part of this team of researchers working in a VA hospital. Researchers, clinicians, I'm not sure what he was doing, but they're working at this hospital, and they're seeing Vietnam vets. And the vets are having those sorts of complaints. They're not able to move forward. They're stuck, having trouble regulating their emotions, all of those things.
So they're not well adjusting back to civilian life.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Right. There's something, they're not able to move forward. So they have to be able to give it a name, give it a diagnosis, to be able to bill for it, to be able to move forward. Something has to be done. So they make it a memory-based disorder. Basically, they're remembering that this thing occurred, and that's what's causing this. But specifically, they're tying it to the situation. They're tying it to their experiences in Vietnam. And so for the longest time, we're understanding trauma as something that happens that's beyond the realm of normal human experience. That these people witness something absolutely horrific, beyond what most people will ever go through in their lives, and that's what causes this reaction.
Right.
And so moving forward, that's our understanding of trauma, but now...
And I think that that's most people's understanding of trauma, if they're not researched on this.
Right. It's the things that happen in the news. Trauma doesn't happen to me growing up in a home where my parents don't respond to, my needs appropriately all of the time.
Yeah.
Trauma is what happens when you witness somebody die, or you witness all of your friends die in combat. Or trauma is what happens when, again, something to do probably with death and near-death experience. And to be fair, trauma does have to do with our biological concern with staying alive. It does have to do with worrying about making it through a situation.
Of course, yeah.
But it's not situation-based. It has to do with us and our perspective.
Our response to it.
Absolutely.
So while other kids may have been left behind at Christopher's house, and been like, yes,
right,
he's got this great jungle gym in the backyard.
Yes,
I'm gonna lose my mind.
Yeah.
It's not that the situation was inherently traumatizing. It was that I was traumatized by the situation.
And it can have to do with your beliefs at the time. So exactly, yes, I'm here by myself. I get to go play on this jungle gym, versus you being concerned, oh my gosh, I'm going to be left here. What if they don't come back? What's going to happen to me? And so you might have two people go through the same event and not come out with the same response to it. Some people went into combat and weren't specifically traumatized by it. Maybe they came back and had the ability to cope, or they were given those resources.
I mean, your grandfather did 3 tours? Mm-hmm. He loved it. Mm-hmm. He talks all the time about how much he loved it.
Yeah, and he doesn't have any sort of reactions like that to things. That sort of like traditional PTSD response.
Yeah.
The other thing that they learned about the veterans who had gone off and come back is that a lot of them were traumatized before they left.
Right.
A lot of people leaving to go were going because they weren't in a good situation.
Yeah.
Were going to escape something that was horrible as well. And so that, before we knew that was also conflicting with our idea of this is specifically based on this one outside of normal human experience scenario. And now we know that anybody can be traumatized.
Because if it was based on that specific scenario, then every single man and woman walking away from that combat situation should have been equally traumatized.
Sure, yeah. You witness this,
Yeah.
and it equals this amount of trauma.
Yeah.
But trauma doesn't have to do with the event.
Yeah, it has to do with you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So would you say, my immediate sort of like toxic masculinity response to that is like, does that fall down to a level of toughness? I witnessed this combat and it didn't break me or it didn't destroy my psyche. Does that mean I'm just more tough than you are?
I think that it has less to do with mental toughness. Sure, we're heading into a scenario with different beliefs, and those beliefs are going to impact the way that we view it. So maybe somebody's going in and they're like, I'm going to live forever. And that's kind of their stance on life, and they get through it and they live, and it doesn't bother them that these other things happened, and they're like, yep, this fits right in with my beliefs in the world, and they carry on. That's going to be rare, right? But maybe that happens. And maybe, or maybe experiencing those things disrupts that belief, and now that is trauma. But I think that the biggest deal there has less to do probably with how tough somebody is, and more to do with what their foundation is. What do they have to fall back on when something bad happens? What's their ability to cope with something that's difficult, which is why childhood experiences can be specifically traumatizing, because we're so vulnerable. We don't have autonomy and the ability to, fix things when something goes wrong. But, yeah, I think that is a big part of it. And then the other thing is, what's your support system like? Who are you coming back to, and how are those people helping you to cope? Oftentimes that toughness, nothing phases me. The reason that I kind of laugh at that is I think that can also be an outcome of trauma.
Right.
So that person going into it might have had some trauma too.
So we kind of strayed a little bit because you were talking to us about Dr. Bessel and his research. So he kind of establishes, perhaps incorrectly, that trauma is related to the incident that these soldiers faced, the circumstances that these soldiers lived through.
Mm-hmm.
What was the evolution of that concept? Because when about was this research taking place?
So following the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know the exact timeline, if I'm honest, for how that developed, but basically we started to see these same things in other people, and they started to recognize that it wasn't unique to the veterans who were coming back. And so as we were learning more about it, well, there were a couple of different evolutions. One was to say, well, maybe it's tied to the situation. One was to say it's a chemical imbalance. I'm trying to think of the third. There was something else that they researched as well. And basically none of those things turned up anything that was very useful, because it turns out that anybody can be traumatized, and any situation can be traumatizing.
So it's safe to say that every single human being has experienced trauma.
Yeah, so I have seen statistics. I feel like the most recent thing that I've seen is something like 70% of Americans have experienced trauma. I think that everybody experiences something that's traumatic, something that stays stuck with them, that they don't really move forward from. Maybe it's not something that really keeps them back in life.
Right.
And that's great if that's true. But I think for a lot of us, there are moments that really live with us, and whether or not they're present in our minds, they impact the way that we go about relationships. They impact the way that we reach for new opportunities and take on new experiences. Because there's a part of us that never moved past that moment and doesn't believe that we will.
So we've talked a little bit about what trauma is, what we used to think it is, and how that's informed so much of our misinformation around trauma. Because if you truly believe that trauma is exclusive to like combat or, you know, terrible car crashes or like newsworthy significant events, then it is disrespectful to hear someone say that this guy yelling at me in the parking lot was traumatizing. You know, like somebody was rude to you and you found that traumatizing. It's disrespectful.
Compared to somebody who lost like dear friends.
Yeah, but that's not how trauma works. Trauma is how you experience a situation, not the situation itself.
Yeah.
And we know that because some folks will go through a combat situation and it destroys them mentally, and some people don't. Because it's not the situation. That's the deciding factor.
Sure.
So we hear a lot of words around trauma. We hear words like, so far we've heard coping, which to me, this is kind of a silly analogy, but from where I can sit, I'm looking at our little fire pit outside. When the fire gets too large, if it catches the grass starts burning, I can run out there and stomp it out with my foot.
Yeah.
That feels like coping, a good analogy for coping.
Sure.
But when the fire like if the grass were to really catch and get out of control, then we're traumatized without the ability to cope, and the backyard's on fire.
Right, it's escaped its bounds.
Yeah. So it's like there's going to be trauma, there's going to be a fire in the fire pit, but can we control it and rationalize it well and place it? Like the child who gets lost at the grocery store now knows that scary things happen in life, but there's a way to control it. There's a
that the people in their lives are care about them, are looking for them, will comfort them. It's okay for them to be upset. All of those.
So to the listener, I encourage you, and I'm encouraging myself, think about the things in your life that crept out of your fire pit and did more damage than they should have. Yeah. And you weren't able to give that the attention that it needed to heal. You know? Absolutely. But let's talk about the word trigger.
Okay.
Because, oh my goodness, I loved some, you know, in my more conservative or Republican period of my life, I was a huge fan of those trigger warning, anti-SJW, you know, like mocking people who claim to have triggers. Yeah. Because it was so foreign, and it's like the world's not going to cater to your what you claim you need. That's not how the world works. Right. And that was as I learned more, a very unkind and unloving and uninformed perspective. Yeah. So talk to us about what a trigger is and how it functions.
Yeah, so in the standard sense, you know, if you are talking about like a combat veteran, a trigger might be hearing a firework, a loud explosion. That sounds like a loud explosion or a gunshot of something that they heard back in that traumatizing environment. A trigger might be, so it might be a specific noise or sound.
And what's happening in that moment?
That's a great question. So really what's happening is that we have this part of our brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is looking out for a situation that threatens our safety. So let's say that you're in a car accident. And during the car accident, you see a blue car go through the light. You hear the crash happening. You hear the song playing on the radio. Maybe you smell something. You smell the brakes. You're having all these different sensory input things happening all at the same time. So now your amygdala needs to work pretty effectively to make sure that you're not in a dangerous situation. If you're out being hunted by, a predator, if you're out being hunted by a lion or something, you don't need to see, hear, feel, touch, smell the lion to know that it's there before you start running. You need to be able to move based on one of those cues to run away and escape this dangerous environment. So same thing with a car crash. any one of those sensory inputs might be a trigger for you moving forward. So you might feel triggered. You might be brought back to that moment, the panic that you felt not being sure if you were going to survive the car crash, by seeing a blue car, by smelling the brakes, by hearing that song on the radio. Now, that song, this is important because that song doesn't have anything to do with what causes a car accident or what was dangerous about the car accident. But your amygdala doesn't really care. It's taking in all of that sensory information and allowing you to respond based on just one of those things to help keep you safe in the future. But now it's not very conducive to just going about your life to have that song be a trigger for you. And so that's why we sometimes end up with these weird things that we make fun of people for that are triggers, because that's the way that your brain works. It's protecting you. You need to be able to run based on the smell of a lion, not just...
No, I'm like a prehistoric human living in the plains of Africa, and I see the grass move a certain way, and I'm like triggered because the last time the grass moved like that, there was a lion. So now I'm running. No evidence if there's a lion or not because the grass moved. That makes sense, right? All of a sudden, the same system does not make sense because I'm freaking out because I smell brake pads. Mm-hmm. Somebody slammed on the brakes and it is making me panicked. Yeah. And I may not even know that it's the smell of the brakes that's making me panicked. Right. All of a sudden, I'm feeling panicked.
Yep, but it's taking you out of being in, like, the logical thinking part of your brain. That alarm goes off in your amygdala, and it sends you back into survival mode. So it sends you into that, like, fight or flight moment. Hopefully, in that situation, it makes you slam on your brakes before you even know what's happening. Maybe you're overcorrecting and maybe that's now creating a dangerous situation. But in general, it's hopefully helping you respond to and avoid having a similar incident happen.
But in a modern world, there's so many misfires.
Yeah, in a modern world, we don't have an environment that just like makes a lot of biological sense for us. There are so many different things. And so triggers can feel really random. And a lot of what we do in counseling is helping people to identify triggers. You know, I don't know why when I walk across campus, I start just feeling like panicky all of a sudden. I'm not seeing anything in particular happen. Right. Well, usually it starts off more vague than that. I just get anxious during the day. I don't know what's happening. And then maybe we figure out it's always walking across campus. And then maybe we figure out it's always a certain time of day. And then we can tie that back to some specific event. And that's a big deal to be able to identify that and work through that moment and figure out what went wrong, what got stuck there in your amygdala.
So we're able to actually start processing this stuff as if we had parents scoop us up and assure us that we're safe and that we're loved. If we're able to actually start talking through these triggers. Yeah. And start thinking through what happened originally to cause us to react to these triggers in this way.
Right, because that got locked in with the understanding of, you know, a 4-year-old or however old you are when that's happening. But you're not 4 anymore. You don't need adults to come in and swoop you up if you get lost in the grocery store. You have everything that you need. Yeah. But that memory lives with all of the awareness and capability of a 4-year-old. Yeah. Well, that's not
locked
fair.
In a part of my brain that's like, run if there's a lion. Right. So that's an important memory.
Yeah, right, survival-based sort of memory. So when you start to go back and figure that out, now I get to experience that moment and to work through it and to figure out what I didn't get that I needed in the moment. And also I get to really cognizantly remind that part of myself that was 4 and lost in the grocery store. Yeah. If I'm separated, if something happens, if I'm disconnected from a loved one, I have all of the things that I need to move forward from that. I'm not waiting for my parents to come around the corner, and the fact that my caretakers weren't the caretakers that they needed to be, I now have the resources that I need. I know how to go out and get those things, or I can learn how to do that.
And part of your role as a counselor focused on trauma is to help people really learn that lesson, that you have what you need to respond appropriately to these triggers.
Yeah, or let's learn how to do that. Maybe you don't have what you need, and that's okay too, but we can figure out how to do that. It's such a gift to be an adult.
Man, I just for the longest time, if I saw somebody post something that maybe had to do with like an assault,
Sure.
and they would say trigger warning, assault,
Mm-hmm.
I would roll my eyes because it's like assault is, we watch assault happen for fun on the media, like for our shows and stuff.
Geez.
Like, we're surrounded by violence. Like, why? Who are you putting these triggers for? What are they? These soft little children that don't exist in the real world. They exist in a fantasy world where everything is spoon fed to them.
Yeah.
And now, years later, I'm like, oh, that putting a trigger warning is an attempt to be kind, not to the people that are easy to make fun of, but the people who are truly traumatized and would re-experience that trauma by reading a story about assault and actively avoid those sorts of stories because they know it triggers them.
Yeah, well, again, recognizing that our world is a very different place than I think the one that's the most like biologically suited to us, and keeping in mind that like the internet contains everything and we have to go there so often for so many parts of our lives, and that somebody who's had this really traumatizing event, maybe they've experienced a sexual assault, in a world without the internet and without TV shows and without everything, there are probably pretty few environments that are going to bring that up for them.
Yeah.
The internet contains a multitude. Just scrolling through Facebook, you're just trying to, decompress, zone out from your day, and how easy is it to scroll past something that might bring up this worst moment of your life and really stick you back there in that place. And that might be a thing that takes days or weeks to recover from, feeling back in that moment. So yeah, what a loving thing it is to be able to say, hey, we're going to talk about this thing. You're just scrolling through your news feed. Yeah. It's not fair that this is coming up now,
right.
But at least you don't have to click and watch the video without knowing what's going to happen.
So what is your message as we wrap up? Yeah. What is your message to the listener who, like me a few years ago, scoffs at the idea of somebody needing trigger warnings, did not, the listener who's like, I haven't experienced trauma.
Sure.
Because I was never in combat.
Yeah.
What's your message to those folks? Or really me, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
What's your message to those people?
I think an important analogy is, there's a difference between a sprained ankle and a shattered bone. Those are two very different injuries, and they're going to require different treatment. But continuing to walk on your sprained ankle and pretend as though nothing happened isn't going to resolve it and will make the situation much worse.
Yeah.
So if you feel stuck in your life but don't feel like it rises to the level of trauma, if you're quick to, and this is actually one aspect that we know is a part of trauma, but if you're quick to believe, other people have it worse, other people have been through worse things, that's great. We'll let other people deal with their shattered bones. That's fine. It doesn't mean that your ankle doesn't need attention. It doesn't mean that there isn't more that can be done there. You don't have to be stuck with it, and pretending like it never happened really can make it worse. It'll continue to impact your life.
When the doctor walks up to your hospital bed, the first thing out of their mouth is not a breakdown of the well-being of all the other patients in the hospital.
Let me tell you who else is here today and why this doesn't matter. Your ankle needs attention either way.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to keep in mind, if you're not sure if you're dealing with trauma, if you don't think that your trauma compares to other people's trauma, that a sprained ankle still needs attention. It can still be made into a much worse issue by ignoring it. And it doesn't serve anybody. It certainly doesn't even serve the person with the really horrible shattered bone injury for you to not treat your ankle. It doesn't do anything for them. It doesn't take away from their injury for you to acknowledge that you have a sprained ankle.
And we can respect the shattered bones, right? It's not disrespectful to pursue help with whatever you're dealing with.
There's nothing disrespectful about getting your ankle checked out.
Yeah.
Just because other people have had, what you consider to be a more severe injury. That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that for a long time we really depended on our own our ability to just pull ourselves through whatever, as a identity, as a culture, as a people, but now we're starting to really deal with the ramifications of undealt with trauma.
It is costly to tuck that stuff down. And I think that in a lot of generations where we haven't wanted to talk about it, or where we've said, the people who have trauma are people who have seen combat and nobody else. Or the people who have trauma are the people who've been through X, Y, or Z. This is nothing. I think that we see the cost there. I think that we see the anger there and the fear-based decision-making there. And we have the ability to do something about that for ourselves.
Yeah. And if we're interested in getting counseling to help with trauma, what's your guidance for us?
Well, you can go to ashtreecounselingcenter.com.
Is that where we can learn more about you and your practice?
That's where you can learn more about me and my practice. Really, I'd say go get counseling. I know that counseling isn't acceptable or accessible for everybody, but learning more about what trauma is, finding reliable sources, listening to clinicians talk about it. There's so many resources like this one, like this podcast. So many now, spaces online to be able to learn about those things. And if you are able to go get counseling, do so. If you need help finding low-cost resources, that's something that I help a lot of people with. And you can contact me there.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your time.
And we'll see you next time here on I Married Your Therapist.